poor maid and her daughter sheltered a billionaire during a heavy storm. The next day, 100 luxury cars showed up at her door. On a storm-soaked November night, a single mother counted the last $45 in her worn wallet. Eviction notices piled on the table, and from the next room came the faint, uneven breaths of her daughter's failing heart, a reminder of the hospital letter that threatened a future she couldn't afford. Then, outside, a violent crash shattered the silence. From the wreckage, a man staggered toward her candlelit window. "Please," he rasped, his voice raw. "Can I just wait out the storm?" She stood frozen at the door, her grandfather's words echoing. "Do what's right." And what started as a stranger's knock ended as a parade of 100 black cars on her doorstep. This is the story of how a single act of kindness changed everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A single act of kindness is a ripple that can return as a tidal wave. Eleanor Vance knew the precise sound of emptiness, and it was ringing in her ears tonight. It was the silence where a second plate should have been at the dinner table, a void left 3 years ago. The rain beat against the thin glass of her small cottage, each drop a tiny hammer against her resolve. Outside, the world was awash of dark gray, the November storm relentlessly trying to force its way inside. The wind moaned through the eaves of the old house, a mournful sound that echoed the ache in Eleanor's own heart. She stood at the sink, her hands submerged in lukewarm water, staring out at nothing. The light above her flickered, threatening to surrender to the storm, much like she felt she was about to do. On the small, wobbly kitchen table sat a stack of envelopes. Most were white with stark red letters, "Final Notice. Overdue." One, however, was a thick, cream-colored envelope from the cardiology department at the state hospital. It was the heaviest of them all, not because of the paper inside, but because of the weight of the words it contained. Words like surgical consultation, prognosis, and figures with so many zeros they looked like a cruel joke. Eleanor pulled her hands from the water and dried them on a dish towel worn nearly transparent from use. She was 42, but felt twice that age. Her hands, though clean, were chapped and red, the hands of a woman who spent her days scrubbing floors and polishing silver in houses that were not her own. She worked as a maid for the wealthy families on the other side of town, in sprawling homes where the cost of a single rug could have paid for her daughter's surgery outright. Yet, in those grand houses, she was invisible, a ghost who cleaned up life's messes and then disappeared. In the next room, her daughter, Chloe, was asleep. Eleanor could hear her soft, slightly labored breathing. Chloe was 9 years old, a tiny beacon of light with hair the color of spun gold and eyes as blue as a summer sky. But a shadow hung over that light. A weakness in her heart, the doctors said. A tiny valve that hadn't formed right. A ticking clock that Eleanor could hear with every beat of her own heart. The surgery could fix it. The surgery could give Chloe a normal life, a future. The surgery also cost more than Eleanor would ever see in a lifetime of cleaning other people's homes. She walked back to the table and picked up her worn leather wallet. She opened it slowly, as if afraid of what she would find, even though she already knew. Inside were 2 $20 bills and a $5. $45. That was it. That was all she had to her name. $45 to last until her next paycheck, which was already spent a dozen times over on rent, on utilities, on the mountain of medical debt that grew larger with every letter that arrived. A wave of cold despair washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She leaned against the table for support, her gaze falling upon a framed photograph on the wall. It was her grandfather, Sergeant Michael Riley, in his crisp army dress uniform. His eyes were kind but firm, his jaw set with a determination that had seen him through 2 wars. He had raised her after her parents were gone, and his voice was a constant presence in her mind. "Courage, Eleanor," he used to say, his voice a low rumble. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, especially when you're terrified." Doing what was right felt like a distant luxury tonight. Right now, survival was the only thing on her mind. The landlord had been clear. If she wasn't paid in full by the end of the week, he'd have no choice but to start eviction proceedings. The thought of being out on the street with a sick child was a nightmare too terrible to contemplate. The lights flickered again, more violently this time, and then died completely, plunging the small cottage into absolute darkness. Chloe let out a small, frightened cry from the other room. "It's okay, sweetie," Eleanor called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just the storm. Mommy's here." She fumbled in a drawer for a book of matches and a half-used candle. A moment later, a small, dancing flame pushed back the oppressive dark, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. The flickering candlelight made the eviction notices on the table seem to dance, their red letters mocking her. As she made her way to Chloe's room, a sudden, violent sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was a terrible screech of metal, followed by a deafening crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cottage. It was close, frighteningly close. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she didn't move, listening only to the wind and the rain and the frantic thumping in her own ears. "Mommy? What was that?" Chloe's voice was small and trembling from her bedroom. "I don't know, baby," Eleanor said, trying to keep the fear out of her own voice. "You stay right there. I'm going to look." She crept to the living room window, her bare feet cold against the worn wooden floorboards. She peered through the rain-streaked glass, trying to see through the impenetrable curtain of the storm. The road in front of her cottage was usually quiet, a simple country lane that saw little traffic. But now, she could just make out a shape. A dark, twisted mass of metal, angled awkwardly into the ditch not 50 yards from her front door. It was a car. A very expensive-looking car, even in its mangled state. Steam or smoke was rising from its hood, quickly swallowed by the rain. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind again. "Do what's right." Her first instinct was to call for help, but the power was out, and her old landline was dead. Her cell phone had been shut off 2 months ago, an unaffordable luxury. She was alone. Whoever was in that car was alone, too. Then she saw it. A figure, stumbling away from the wreckage. A man. He was moving slowly, unsteadily, one hand pressed to his head. He seemed disoriented, turning in a slow circle before finally fixing his gaze on the one point of light in the overwhelming darkness, the candle flickering in her window. He began to walk toward her cottage. Every instinct screamed at Eleanor to bolt the door, to blow out the candle, to hide. She was a woman alone with a sick child. The man was a stranger, coming from a wreck, and there was no telling what state of mind he was in. He could be hurt. He could be dangerous. He could be drunk. Opening her door to him was a risk she couldn't afford. He was closer now. She could see he was tall, but his shoulders were slumped in pain or exhaustion. His clothes were dark and soaked through, torn in several places. He was limping heavily. He looked less like a threat and more like a man at the end of his rope. He reached her small, covered porch and collapsed against one of the wooden support posts, his head bowed. He didn't try the door. He didn't bang or shout. He just stood there, catching his breath, as if the final few steps to her door were a mountain he did not have the strength to climb. Eleanor looked from the man on her porch to the photograph of her grandfather on the wall. She thought of all the stories he'd told her about finding soldiers in ditches, about helping people who had nothing left, about the simple, profound duty of one human being to help another in a time of crisis. He had never turned his back on someone in need. Not once. "Mommy." Chloe was standing in the doorway of her bedroom, her small frame silhouetted by the candlelight from the kitchen. Her favorite stuffed bear was clutched tightly in her arms. "Is someone there?" Eleanor looked at her daughter's face, so pale and full of trust. What was she teaching her by hiding? What kind of world was she showing her if they locked their door on a man who was clearly hurt? The $45 in her wallet felt like a paper-thin shield against the world's problems. It was nothing. But kindness was free. It was the only currency she had left in abundance. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the deadbolt. She turned the lock. The clicks sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She opened the door. The man on the porch slowly lifted his head. The storm raged behind him, a chaotic symphony of wind and rain. In the faint, flickering light from her candle, Eleanor could see his face for the first time. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with graying hair plastered to his forehead. There was a nasty gash above his right eyebrow, blood trickling down his temple, mingling with the rain. His face was etched with lines of exhaustion and pain, but his eyes, his eyes were what stopped her. They were a startlingly clear shade of blue, and in their depths, she saw not danger, but a profound and desperate plea. "Please," he rasped, his voice rough and low. "My car. I crashed. Can I just wait out the storm?" His gaze drifted past her, into the meager warmth of her home. He saw the single candle, the threadbare furniture. He saw little Chloe, peeking out from behind her mother's legs, her wide, curious eyes fixed on him. Eleanor hesitated for only a second more. Then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Coming out of the rain." The man let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an eternity. The relief that flooded his features was so absolute, so profound, it was almost painful to watch. He nodded his thanks, unable to speak, and took one shaky, limping step across her threshold. As he entered, he brought the cold of the storm in with him. Water dripped from his expensive, ruined coat, forming a small puddle on her worn wooden floor. He seemed to be trying to make himself smaller, acutely aware of the mess he was making in her tidy, if humble, home. He kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening, despite his size. "Thank you," he said again, his voice gaining a little more strength. I don't know what I would have done." "You're bleeding," Eleanor stated simply, her own fear receding as a sense of purpose took over. She closed the door, shutting out the roar of the storm. The cottage immediately felt warmer, safer. "Let me see that." Before he could protest, she was guiding him to one of the two chairs at her kitchen table. He moved stiffly, his body clearly battered from the crash. He sank into the chair with a quiet groan of pain. "Chloe, honey, can you go to the bathroom and get the little white box for Mommy?" Eleanor asked, her tone gentle. Chloe nodded, her initial fear of the stranger already being replaced by a childish desire to help. She scurried off, her bare feet making soft padding sounds on the floor. Eleanor lit another candle, giving the room a bit more light. In the stronger glow, the man looked even worse. His suit, which she could now see was tailored from a fine, expensive wool, was torn at the sleeve and covered in mud. But it was his face that held her attention. It was a strong face, one used to authority, but right now it was stripped of all its power, leaving only vulnerability behind. "My name is Eleanor," she said, more to fill the silence than anything else. "And that's my daughter, Chloe." The man looked toward the hallway where Chloe had disappeared. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "I'm James," he said. He paused, then frowned in concentration. "Just James." He seemed confused, as if he'd expected more to follow but couldn't find the words. The look in his eyes became distant, clouded. Chloe returned, holding a small plastic first aid kit. She approached the stranger cautiously and held it out to her mother. "Thank you, sweet pea," Eleanor said, giving her daughter's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. She opened the box and took out some antiseptic wipes and a clean cloth. "This might sting," she warned James, dabbing gently at the cut on his forehead. He flinched slightly, but otherwise sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on her face. He seemed to be studying her, his blue eyes sharp and intelligent despite the pain and confusion that swam in them. "Where were you headed?" Eleanor asked as she worked. James shook his head slowly, a pained expression crossing his face. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice laced with frustration. I can't seem to remember clearly. The rain was so heavy. I think I was trying to find a place to pull over." His hand went to his head again. "Everything feels foggy. Amnesia." The crash must have given him a concussion. This was more serious than she'd thought. He needed a doctor. But they were trapped. The storm was getting worse, and she had no way to call for help. For now, all she could offer was the shelter of her home. She finished cleaning the wound and placed a small bandage over it. "There," she said. "That should keep it clean. You need to get out of those wet clothes. You'll catch your death." She thought of her late husband's things, packed away in a trunk in her closet. He had been a smaller man than James, but a dry shirt and a pair of old sweatpants would be better than nothing. "Let me see what I can find." She went into her bedroom and opened the old cedar chest at the foot of her bed. The scent of mothballs and memory washed over her. It had been 3 years since she'd lost Daniel, but some days the grief was as fresh as a new wound. She pulled out a thick flannel shirt and a pair of gray sweatpants. They were worn but clean. When she returned, James was talking to Chloe. Her daughter was standing by his chair, holding up her stuffed bear, Mr. Patches, for his inspection. His ear came off last year, Chloe was explaining solemnly. But Mommy sewed it back on. She can fix anything. James looked at the bear, then at Chloe, and the sad smile returned to his face. I can see that, he said softly. Your mommy is very good at fixing things. The simple exchange sent a pang through Eleanor's chest. It was a scene of such quiet domesticity, a man, a woman, and a child in a candlelit kitchen. It was everything she had lost, and everything she desperately wanted for her daughter. She handed the clothes to James. The bathroom is just down that hall, she said, pointing. They might be a little small, but they're dry. Thank you, he said again, his gratitude so sincere it was almost humbling. He rose from the chair, moving carefully, and made his way to the bathroom. While he was gone, Eleanor turned her attention to the most pressing problem, food. She had planned on a simple dinner of canned soup and the last of a loaf of bread for herself and Chloe. It was barely enough for two, let alone three. Her stomach growled in protest. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, wanting to make sure Chloe had enough. She looked at the $45 in her wallet, then at the single can of tomato soup in her pantry. The situation was absurd. A man who wore a suit that likely cost thousands of dollars was in her bathroom, and she was worried about splitting a can of soup with him. But he was her guest, and he was hurt. Her grandfather's code was simple. You always feed a guest at your table. No matter how little you have, you share it. She opened the can of soup and poured it into a small pot, adding a little water to stretch it further. She lit the small propane camp stove she kept for emergencies like this. As the soup began to warm, the simple aroma filled the small kitchen, a smell of warmth and comfort that stood in defiance of the cold, howling storm outside. When James returned, he looked like a different person. The dry clothes, though ill-fitting, seemed to have restored some of his dignity. He had washed the remaining blood and grime from his face. The exhaustion was still there, deep in the lines around his eyes, but he looked less like a victim and more like a man simply weathering a storm. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes on the small pot on the camp stove. He looked from the pot to Eleanor, an unreadable expression on his face. Please, don't trouble yourself for me, he said. You've already done more than enough. It's no trouble, Eleanor replied, her voice firm. It's just soup. Everyone's got to eat. She ladled the thin soup into 3 mismatched bowls. She gave the largest portion to Chloe, then split the remainder between James and herself, making sure his bowl was slightly fuller. She tore the last 4 slices of bread in half and placed them on a plate in the center of the table. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against ceramic and the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof. The soup was watery and the bread was stale, but it was hot. It was nourishment. In the warm, flickering candlelight, it felt like a feast. James ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every spoonful. He wasn't eating like a man used to fine dining. He was eating like a man who was genuinely hungry, genuinely grateful for a simple, hot meal. This is the best meal I've had in a very long time, he said, his voice quiet, but full of conviction. Eleanor just nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She didn't know if he was saying it to be polite, or if the shock and cold had truly made this meager meal seem like a banquet. Chloe, finished with her soup, was starting to nod off, her head drooping against her chest. Come on, sleepyhead, Eleanor said softly. Time for bed. She picked up her daughter, who was light as a feather in her arms. As she carried Chloe to her room, she could feel James's eyes on her. She tucked Chloe into her small bed, pulling the thin but well-loved quilt up to her chin. She kissed her forehead. Good night, Mommy, Chloe mumbled, already half asleep. Good night, my sweet pea. When Eleanor returned to the kitchen, James was standing by the window, looking out into the blackness. The storm doesn't seem to be letting up, he said without turning around. It will pass, Eleanor said. They always do. He finally turned to face her. His gaze swept around the small room, taking in the worn furniture, the peeling paint on the window frame, the stack of bills on the table. His eyes lingered for a moment on the cream-colored envelope from the hospital. You're in some kind of trouble, aren't you? He asked. His voice was not pitying, but direct, a simple statement of fact. Eleanor stiffened. Her poverty felt like a raw, exposed nerve, and his question was a careless touch. I'm fine, she said, her voice clipped. We're fine. I'm sorry, he said immediately. recognizing his misstep. That was out of line. It's none of my business. He gestured toward the couch in the small living room area. If it's all right, I'll just sleep there. I'll be out of your way first thing in the morning, as soon as the storm breaks. You can have my bed, Eleanor offered, the words coming out before she could stop them. You're hurt. You need a proper night's rest. I can sleep on the couch. He shook his head firmly. Absolutely not. I'm a guest in your home, a stranger you were kind enough to let in. I will not take your bed. The couch is more than enough. His tone was final, leaving no room for argument. Eleanor relented with a small nod. She gathered the 2 thickest blankets she owned and a pillow that had seen better days. As she handed them to him, their fingers brushed. His hand was calloused and warm, a strange contrast to his expensive, ruined suit. Thank you, Eleanor, he said, his blue eyes meeting hers. For everything. Get some rest, James, she said softly. As she settled onto the lumpy couch, pulling a thin Afghan over her, she couldn't quiet the turmoil in her mind. She had let a complete stranger into her home, a man with no memory, who had appeared out of a storm. She had shared her last bit of food with him. She was now sleeping on her own couch while he occupied hers. By every logical measure, she had been foolish, reckless. But as she lay there in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain and the quiet breathing of the man in the other room, she didn't feel foolish. She felt calm. For the first time in a long, long time, the crushing weight of her problems seemed to have lifted just for a moment. She had done what was right. And somehow, in the heart of the storm, that felt like enough. Eleanor woke with a start, disoriented. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The lumpy texture beneath her and the unfamiliar angle of the room slowly brought the previous night's events back into focus. The couch, the storm, the stranger, James. She sat up, her back aching in protest. The cottage was filled with a soft, gray light, the kind that follows a powerful storm. The rain had stopped, and the silence was profound, broken only by the gentle sound of dripping water from the eaves. She looked toward her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see James sitting on the edge of her bed. He was already dressed in his own clothes, which he had neatly draped over a chair the night before to dry. They were still damp and hopelessly wrinkled, but he wore them with an air of quiet dignity. He wasn't looking around the room. He was staring at his own hands, turning them over and over as if they were foreign objects he was seeing for the first time. Eleanor rose quietly from the couch, folding the thin Afghan. She tiptoed to Chloe's room and peeked inside. Her daughter was still fast asleep, her small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. The sight eased a knot of tension in Eleanor's own chest. When she turned back, James was standing in the hallway. He looked up, and their eyes met. A flicker of something, embarrassment, perhaps, or gratitude, crossed his face. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet house. "I hope I didn't. I mean, thank you for the bed. I haven't slept that soundly in years." "It was nothing," Eleanor said, though her aching back disagreed. "Are you feeling any better? Your head." He touched the bandage on his forehead. "It's a bit tender, but the fog, it's lifting. Slowly. I still can't quite grasp details." He looked frustrated, like a man trying to solve a complex puzzle with half the pieces missing. From Chloe's room, there was a small cough, followed by the sound of stirring. A moment later, Chloe appeared in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. When she saw James, she didn't hide. Instead, a small, shy smile graced her lips. "Good morning, Mr. James," she said, her voice soft. James's serious expression melted away, replaced by one of genuine warmth. He knelt, wincing slightly as he did, so that he was on her level. "Good morning, Chloe. Did you sleep well?" Chloe nodded, holding up Mr. Patches. "He did. He wasn't even scared of the storm. He's a very brave bear," James said, his gaze gentle. "You're lucky to have him." The simple, natural interaction between them was disarming. He was a stranger, yet he spoke to her daughter with a kindness that felt anything but strange. Eleanor found herself watching them, a small, involuntary smile touching her own lips. It was a fleeting moment of normalcy in a life that was anything but. The moment was shattered by a sharp, official-sounding rap on the front door. Eleanor froze. Her heart leaped into her throat. She knew who it was without even looking. It was too early for the mailman, and she wasn't expecting any other visitors. It could only be one person. Mr. Henderson, the landlord. Her eyes darted to the stack of bills on the kitchen table, the eviction notice sitting malevolently on top. He had said the end of the week. Today was Friday. He had come to collect. "Who is it, Mommy?" Chloe asked, her voice laced with the same anxiety she heard in her mother's silence. "It's okay, sweetie," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "Why don't you and Mr. James look at your picture books in your room for a minute?" James seemed to understand immediately. He saw the flash of panic in Eleanor's eyes, the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. He rose to his feet. "That's a wonderful idea," he said to Chloe, his tone light and reassuring. "You can introduce me to some of Mr. Patches's friends." He gently guided the little girl back into her room, closing the door behind them, giving Eleanor the privacy she needed. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Eleanor took a deep breath, schooling her features into a mask of calm she did not feel. She walked to the door and opened it. Mr. Henderson stood on her porch, a portly man with a perpetually sour expression. He was holding a clipboard, a pen tucked behind his ear. He looked past her, his eyes scanning the interior of her cottage with disdain. "Eleanor," he said, his tone devoid of any warmth. "I trust you have my money." "Mr. Henderson," Eleanor began, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to keep it steady. "The storm, the power is out. My bank. I couldn't get to the bank yesterday." It was a lie, a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. There was no money in the bank. Henderson let out an exasperated sigh. "I've heard it all before, Eleanor. Excuses. Always excuses. You're 2 months behind. I have my own bills to pay. A mortgage on this place. I am not a charity." "I know that," she said, her cheeks flushing with shame. "I just need a little more time. I have a new job I'm starting. I'll have the money next week. I promise." Another lie. There was no new job. There was only the same back-breaking work that barely paid enough to keep them fed. Henderson shook his head, a look of finality in his eyes. "I've given you all the time I can. The notice stands. I have an agent from the sheriff's department scheduled to come by on Monday morning to see you out. I'm sorry, Eleanor, but my hands are tied." He made a check mark on his clipboard. "Have your things packed and be gone by then." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked down the porch steps, his heavy footsteps sounding like nails being hammered into a coffin. Eleanor stood in the open doorway, the cool morning air chilling her to the bone. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Monday. She had until Monday. 2 days. 2 days to find a new home, to pack up what little she owned, to figure out how to survive. It was an impossible, insurmountable task. She closed the door, her movements slow and robotic. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood, her eyes squeezed shut against the tears that threatened to fall. She would not cry. She would not fall apart. Not in front of Chloe. Not in front of a stranger. She took a series of deep, shuddering breaths and turned around. James was standing in the hallway, his expression grim. He had clearly heard every word. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I couldn't help but overhear." Eleanor just shook her head, unable to speak. The shame was a physical thing, a burning heat that spread through her chest. To have her deepest struggles laid bare in front of this man felt like the final indignity. "It's fine," she finally managed to choke out. She walked past him into the kitchen and began to busy herself, rearranging the already clean dishes on the counter. Anything to avoid looking at him, to avoid the pity she was sure she would see in his eyes. But when he spoke again, his voice contained no pity, only a quiet intensity. "Let me help." Eleanor stopped what she was doing. She turned to face him, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Help? How can you possibly help? You don't even know who you are." The words were cruel, and she regretted them the moment they were out of her mouth. James didn't flinch. "I may not remember my name," he said, his voice steady, "but I know what I see. I see a good woman, a kind mother, who is being crushed by circumstances she doesn't deserve." He took a step closer. "You gave me shelter. You gave me food. You showed me kindness when you had every reason not to. Please, let me repay you." "And how would you do that?" Eleanor asked, her voice dripping with a sarcasm born of despair. "Do you have a few $1,000s in that ruined suit of yours?" James fell silent. He looked down at his wrinkled clothes, then back at her. "No," he admitted. I don't have anything." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "But I can work. I can fix things." Just then, Chloe came out of her room, holding a small, battery-operated toy dog. "It's broken, Mommy," she said sadly, holding it up. "It won't bark anymore." Eleanor took the toy, ready to offer a comforting word, and put it aside to be forgotten. But James stepped forward. "May I see it?" he asked Chloe. Chloe looked to her mother for permission. Eleanor gave a slight, weary nod. Chloe handed the toy dog to James. He turned it over in his large hands with a surprising delicacy. His brow furrowed in concentration. He asked Eleanor for a small screwdriver, which she retrieved from a kitchen drawer. For the next 10 minutes, he sat at the kitchen table, completely absorbed in the small plastic toy. He opened the battery compartment, checked the connections, and then, using the tip of the screwdriver, made a tiny adjustment to a small metal contact inside. He closed it back up and pushed the button on its head. A tinny, electronic woof, woof filled the quiet kitchen. Chloe's face lit up with pure, unadulterated joy. "You fixed it," she squealed, clapping her hands together. "You fixed it, Mr. James." James smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his face, making him look younger. He handed the toy back to Chloe. "It was just a loose connection," he said simply. Eleanor watched the exchange, a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. It was a small thing, a child's toy. But the focus, the skill, the quiet confidence with which he had diagnosed and solved the problem, it was mesmerizing. It was the work of an engineer, or a mechanic, or someone who understood how things fit together. It was not the work of an ordinary man. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. James looked up at her, his smile fading slightly as he saw the turmoil in her eyes. "Eleanor," he said, his voice serious again, "that man is trying to take your home. Your daughter's home. We can't let that happen." "We?" she repeated, the words sounding foreign on her tongue. It had been so long since there had been a "we" in her life. "Yes, we," he insisted. "There has to be a way. Let's think. Is there anything of value in the house? Anything you could sell?" Eleanor let out another humorless laugh. "Value? Look around, James. This is it. A few sticks of worn-out furniture. Old dishes. The only thing of any real value in this entire house is that." She pointed to the wall, to the framed photograph of her grandfather, Sergeant Michael Riley. Next to the photograph, mounted in a simple black shadow box, was a medal. It was a dark, star-shaped medal with a blue ribbon, the kind that doesn't gleam or sparkle. It was muted, somber. It was the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the nation's highest military honors. "My grandfather," she said, her voice softening. "He was a hero. He saved his entire platoon during an ambush. That was his medal. He told me it was to remind me that one person, doing the right thing, can change everything." James walked over to the wall and studied the medal, his expression unreadable. He looked at the inscription, then at the proud, steadfast face of the young soldier in the photograph. He stood there for a long time, so long that Eleanor began to feel uncomfortable. It was as if he was seeing something more than just a medal and a picture. It was as if he was reading a story only he could understand. "He was a brave man," James said finally, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite place. He turned to face her. "You can't sell this. It's your heritage. It's your daughter's heritage. It's a piece of metal," Eleanor said, her voice hardening again as the reality of her situation crashed back in. "It can't pay the rent. It can't buy the medicine Chloe needs." Her gaze fell upon the cream-colored envelope from the hospital, a stark reminder of the other, more terrifying ticking clock in her life. Before James could respond, another sound pierced the morning quiet. It was the crunch of tires on the gravel road outside. But it wasn't a single car. It sounded like more. Many more. A sense of unease prickled Eleanor's skin. First Mr. Henderson, now this. She went to the window and peered out. Her breath caught in her throat. Lined up on the narrow country road in front of her tiny cottage was a fleet of cars. Not just any cars. These were sleek, black, luxury sedans. Mercedes, BMWs, Audis. There were at least a dozen of them, gleaming in the morning light, their presence in this poor, rural setting as incongruous as a spaceship landing in a cornfield. Men in dark, impeccably tailored suits were getting out of the cars. They moved with a quiet, efficient purpose, their expressions serious, their eyes scanning the area. They looked like Secret Service agents. Eleanor's heart began to hammer against her ribs. What was happening? Who were these people? Were they with Henderson? Had he sent them to throw her out early? One of the men, a tall, stern-looking man with an earpiece, pointed toward her cottage. Several of the others began to walk purposefully toward her front door. "James," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Who are these people?" She turned from the window. James was standing right behind her. He had also been looking out the window, but his expression was not one of fear. It was one of dawning recognition. The fog in his eyes was rapidly clearing, replaced by a look of sharp, undeniable authority. The lost, amnesiac victim was gone. In his place stood a man who was powerful, confident, and very much in charge. He looked at the approaching men, then he looked at Eleanor. A wry, almost apologetic smile touched his lips. "I believe, Eleanor," he said, his voice calm and steady as the men in suits began to ascend their porch steps, "that my ride is here." The knock on the door was not a knock. It was a firm, resonant sound that spoke of authority and expected no delay. It was the sound of a world Eleanor did not belong to, arriving on her doorstep. Eleanor stood frozen, her hand still clutching the windowsill. The fear she had felt when Mr. Henderson arrived was a pale shadow compared to the icy dread that gripped her now. These men were not here about the rent. Their presence felt far more significant and far more dangerous. James put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The gesture was calm and steady, a small anchor in the swirling storm of her anxiety. "It's all right, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and meant for her alone. "Let them in." She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time since he'd spoken. The change was profound. The lost, vulnerable man who had stumbled out of the storm was gone. In his place was a man who radiated an aura of absolute command. The confusion had vanished from his blue eyes, replaced by a sharp, piercing intelligence. He was no longer a guest in her home. He was a king holding court in a borrowed room. With a trembling hand, Eleanor reached for the doorknob. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was the tall, stern one she had seen from the window. He was flanked by two other men, equally imposing. Their dark suits were perfectly pressed, a stark contrast to the damp, wrinkled mess of James's own clothes. The lead man's eyes flickered past Eleanor, ignoring her completely, and settled on James. A wave of palpable relief washed over the stern man's features. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice a deep, respectful baritone. "Thank God. We've been searching all night." Sterling. The name hung in the air, foreign and heavy. James, Mr. Sterling, stepped forward, moving past Eleanor to stand in the doorway. He was no longer the limping, injured man from the night before. He stood tall, his shoulders back, his presence seeming to fill the entire cottage. "It's all right, Arthur," he said to the man. "The storm was worse than we anticipated. My car hit a patch of black ice." He gestured vaguely toward the road. "It's in the ditch down the way. You'll need to have it recovered." "We've already seen it, sir," Arthur replied. The emergency transponder activated on impact, but the signal was weak due to the storm. "It took us hours to pinpoint your location. Are you injured?" "Nothing a good night's rest couldn't fix," James said, his gaze briefly shifting to Eleanor. "Thanks to Mrs. Vance." For the first time, Arthur and the other men seemed to truly see Eleanor. Their professional, impersonal gazes fell upon her, assessing her worn clothes, her humble home. Eleanor felt herself shrink under their scrutiny, a sudden, acute awareness of her poverty washing over her. She was a peasant being noticed by the royal court. Arthur gave her a curt, professional nod. "Ma'am," he said, the single-worded dismissal. His attention was already back on James. "Sir, we have a secure vehicle ready. Your 10 o'clock meeting with the board has been pushed to a video conference at noon. Your daughter has been informed that you are safe." She was concerned. At the mention of a daughter, a flicker of emotion crossed James's face. It was a brief glimpse of the father behind the formidable businessman. "Good," he said. "That's good." He then turned fully to face Eleanor. The men in suits waited in silence, their posture betraying a deep, ingrained patience. They were men paid to wait for this one man. "Eleanor," James began, his voice softer now, the authority replaced by a gentle sincerity. "I owe you an apology, and a debt of gratitude that I can never truly repay." Eleanor could only shake her head, her mind struggling to process the dizzying turn of events. "James Sterling," she stammered. "I don't understand." A faint, wry smile touched his lips. "My full name is James Sterling. I am a businessman. This was the understatement of the century, and the look in his eyes told her he knew it. A quick search on the internet would have told her he wasn't just a businessman. He was the businessman. James Sterling was the CEO of Sterling Innovations, a global technology conglomerate. He was a billionaire many times over, a household name in the worlds of finance and philanthropy. His face was a regular feature on the covers of magazines she saw in the checkout lines at the grocery store. And he had spent the night in her home, eaten her watered-down soup, and slept in her worn-out bed. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. You fixed my daughter's toy dog," she said, the words coming out in a bewildered whisper. A genuine smile broke through his serious demeanor. "I started my company by tinkering with electronics in my parents' garage. Some habits die hard." His smile faded as his eyes swept around the small, impoverished room. He looked at the eviction notice still sitting on the table. He looked at the photograph of her grandfather. He looked at the single, cream-colored envelope from the hospital. "I overheard your conversation this morning with your landlord," he said, his tone turning serious. "And last night, I couldn't help but see the letter from the hospital. Eleanor, you took me in when I was a stranger, hurt and with nothing to offer. You shared the last of your food with me. You gave me shelter and asked for nothing in return, even when you and your daughter are facing this." He gestured around the room, encompassing all of her struggles in a single, sweeping motion. That kind of integrity, that kind of compassion, it's the rarest and most valuable commodity in the world. It's certainly rarer than money. He turned to Arthur. "Arthur, I need you to do a few things for me." "Sir," the man replied, his attention absolute. "First," James said, his voice now crisp and authoritative, "I want you to find out who owns this property. Purchase it. Pay whatever the owner is asking. I want the deed in Mrs. Vance's name by the end of the day. No mortgages, no liens. Title free and clear." Eleanor's jaw dropped. She felt a wave of dizziness, and she put a hand on the wall to steady herself. "What? No, you can't." James held up a hand, silencing her protests with a look that was both kind and unyielding. "Second," he continued, his eyes still on Arthur, "contact my personal physician, Dr. Evans. Have him clear his schedule. I want him to consult on the case of a 9-year-old girl named Chloe Vance. She has a heart condition. I want the best team in the country assembled. The very best. Whatever surgery or treatment is required will be handled at the Sterling Children's Wing at the University Hospital. All expenses will be covered by my personal foundation. All of them. For the rest of her life." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, hot and unstoppable. They streamed down her cheeks, but she was too shocked to even wipe them away. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a fantastic, impossible dream from which she would soon awaken. "And third, Arthur," James said, his voice softening as he turned his gaze back to Eleanor. "Have 100 of our finest cars brought here. The best of the best. Line them up on this road." This final command was so bizarre, so utterly baffling, that both Eleanor and Arthur stared at him in confusion. "Sir?" Arthur asked, a rare note of uncertainty in his voice. 100 cars. "Yes," James said firmly. 100 luxury cars. And I want them filled with groceries. And toys for a 9-year-old girl. And new furniture. And clothes. And everything a person could possibly need to fill a new home." He looked directly at Eleanor, his blue eyes locking with hers. "I want your landlord, Mr. Henderson, to see it. I want everyone in this town to see what happens when a good person does the right thing." He was making a statement. A loud, extravagant, undeniable statement. It wasn't just about helping her. It was about honoring her. It was about showing the world that her act of simple, selfless kindness was worth more than all the riches in the world. He then took a step toward her, his expression gentle. "Eleanor, your grandfather was right. One person doing the right thing can change everything. Last night, you were that person. You saved me, not just from the storm, but from a coldness that can creep in when you spend too much time in my world. You reminded me of what truly matters." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. "This has my personal number on it. You will never have to worry about anything ever again. I promise you that." He placed the card in her trembling hand. Her fingers closed around the thick cardstock, the embossed letters feeling alien and surreal. From the bedroom, Chloe emerged, awakened by the unfamiliar voices. She was holding her newly fixed toy dog. She saw the men in suits, the open door, and the strange tension in the room. She ran to her mother, wrapping her arms around her legs. James knelt, just as he had before, bringing himself down to her level. "Hello again, Chloe," he said softly. "Are you leaving Mr. James?" she asked, her voice small. "I am," he said, "but I have a feeling we'll see each other again very soon." He looked at the toy dog in her hand. "You take care of that little guy for me, okay?" Chloe nodded solemnly. James rose to his full height. He gave Eleanor one last look, a look that conveyed a universe of gratitude and respect. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. The men in suits fell in around him, a silent, protective phalanx, and escorted him to one of the waiting black cars. Eleanor stood in her doorway, Chloe clutching her legs, and watched as the car door closed. The long line of vehicles started their engines, a low, powerful rumble that seemed to make the very ground vibrate. One by one, they pulled away, disappearing down the country road, leaving her small cottage in a cloud of dust and disbelief. She was left standing in the silence, the business card still clutched in her hand. The only evidence of the morning's incredible events was the puddle of water on her floor where a stranger had dripped dry, and the faint, tinny bark of a toy dog that a billionaire had taken the time to fix. She looked at the eviction notice, then at the hospital letter. They were just pieces of paper now, their power to terrorize her utterly broken. The weight that had been crushing her for years had not just been lifted, it had been obliterated. A shaky laugh escaped her lips, a sound that was half sob, half pure, unadulterated joy. She knelt and hugged her daughter tightly, burying her face in the little girl's soft, blonde hair. "It's going to be okay, sweetie," she whispered, the tears flowing freely now. "Everything is going to be okay." It was not even 9 o'clock in the morning. Her entire world had been turned upside down, shattered, and then rebuilt, all in the space of a single evening and the next day. The ripple from her small act of kindness had indeed returned, not as a tidal wave, but as a fleet of 100 luxury cars, arriving to change her life forever. And as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over her small cottage, Eleanor Vance knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her grandfather had been right all along. For a long time after the last black car disappeared, Eleanor remained in the doorway, the world feeling strangely muffled and slow. The morning sun, now fully free of the storm clouds, cast long shadows across her small patch of lawn. It illuminated the muddy tire tracks left by the fleet of cars, the only physical evidence that the past few minutes had not been a figment of her overwrought imagination. Chloe tugged on her sleeve. "Mommy, are you okay? You're crying again." Eleanor looked down at her daughter and realized she was. But these were not the hot, desperate tears of the night before. These were tears of release, of a pressure valve being opened after years of being clamped shut. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and managed a watery smile. "I'm okay, sweet pea," she said, her voice thick. "In fact, I think I'm better than okay." She led Chloe back inside, closing the door on the quiet country road. The cottage, which had felt like a cage of poverty and despair only an hour ago, now seemed different. It felt like home, a real home, one that could not be taken from them. She looked at the business card in her hand. James Sterling. The name felt like a prayer answered, a miracle she hadn't even dared to ask for. She made them breakfast, the last of the oatmeal, cooked on the camp stove. It felt different, too. It wasn't a meal of scarcity, it was simply a meal. As Chloe ate, chattering happily about the man who had fixed her toy dog, Eleanor's mind raced. The house, the surgery, a lifetime of worry, of sleepless nights spent staring at a ceiling she didn't own, had been erased in a matter of minutes. It was too much to comprehend. An hour passed, then another. A fragile sense of normalcy began to settle over them. Eleanor started to wonder if she had dreamed it all. Perhaps the concussion had been hers. Perhaps James Sterling was just a figment, a fantasy cooked up by a mind pushed to its breaking point. The business card in her pocket felt heavy, a single, tangible piece of evidence. It was then that she heard it. It started as a low, distant hum, a vibration she felt more than heard. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the sound of engines. Many engines. Far more than the dozen or so cars from before. It sounded like an entire army was on the move. Chloe ran to the window, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mommy, look! The cars are back." Eleanor rushed to her side, her heart beginning to pound a new, anxious rhythm. What she saw made her gasp. It was a parade, a slow-moving, impossibly long procession of the most beautiful and expensive cars she had ever seen. There were sleek Rolls-Royces, stately Bentleys, and powerful Ferraris in gleaming shades of black, silver, and deep crimson. They moved with a silent, electric grace, filling the narrow road from one end to the other, a river of polished chrome and steel flowing through the humble countryside. There weren't just a dozen. There were dozens upon dozens. It had to be 100. The lead car, a majestic black Rolls-Royce Phantom, pulled to a stop directly in front of her cottage. The cars behind it followed suit, the entire procession coming to a silent, coordinated halt. Doors opened in unison, and drivers in crisp, uniformed attire stepped out, standing at attention by their vehicles. The scene was surreal, a breathtaking display of wealth and power so extreme it bordered on the absurd. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the incredible sight. They stood in their yards, their mouths agape, pointing and whispering. This was a quiet, forgotten corner of the world. Nothing like this had ever happened here. And then, another, far less luxurious vehicle appeared. It was Mr. Henderson's sputtering Ford pickup truck. He was on his way to his next property, his face set in its usual sour scowl. But as he rounded the bend and saw the automotive spectacle blocking his path, he slammed on his brakes. His truck skidded to a halt a few feet from the last car in the line. He got out of his truck, his face a mask of pure confusion. He stomped toward the front of the line, his expression shifting from confusion to outrage. "What in the blazes is going on here?" he bellowed, his voice accustomed to intimidating tenants, not uniformed chauffeurs. "You're blocking the road. I've got business to attend to." None of the drivers so much as glanced at him. Their attention was fixed on the cottage. Just then, Arthur, the stern man from before, emerged from the lead Rolls-Royce. He held a sleek tablet in his hand. He walked past Mr. Henderson as if he were a piece of inconvenient furniture and strode up Eleanor's porch steps. He knocked softly on the door. Eleanor, feeling as though she were moving through a dream, opened it. "Mrs. Vance," Arthur said, his tone formal but not unkind. "Mr. Sterling sends his compliments. The first of the deliveries have arrived." "Deliveries?" Eleanor repeated numbly. "Yes," Arthur said with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. As instructed, he gestured to the line of cars. The drivers, on some unseen signal, began to open the trunks and doors of their vehicles. They were not empty. The cars were filled to the brim. From one, a driver pulled out bags and bags of groceries, fresh fruit, vegetables, meats, cheeses, things Eleanor hadn't been able to afford in years. From another came boxes of brand-new toys, games, and books. A third car revealed stacks of soft, new clothes for both a woman and a young girl. Another held kitchen supplies, new pots and pans, a gleaming coffee maker. It was a clown car of charity, an endless stream of provisions pouring from the trunks of $100,000 automobiles. Mr. Henderson watched, his jaw hanging open, his face turning a shade of mottled red. He marched up to Arthur. "What is this? What are you doing?" Arthur finally turned to face him, his expression one of cool disinterest. "Are you Mr. Henderson?" he asked, his voice dripping with ice. "I am." Henderson puffed up, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "I own this property, and this woman," he jerked a thumb toward Eleanor, "is being evicted on Monday for failure to pay." Arthur raised a single, unimpressed eyebrow. "That is no longer the case. As of 10:17 this morning, the property at this address was purchased in full by a private trust acting on behalf of my employer. The deed has already been filed electronically with the county clerk. Mrs. Eleanor Vance is the new and sole owner. Your presence here, therefore, constitutes trespassing." Henderson's face went from red to a pasty white. He stammered, his blustering confidence completely deflating. "Purchased? But I didn't who? You'll find the payment, well above your asking price, has been wired to your bank account," Arthur continued, turning his attention back to his tablet. "I suggest you check it, and then I suggest you leave." Henderson stood there, utterly defeated, the wind knocked out of his sails. He looked at Eleanor, who met his gaze not with triumph, but with a quiet, unassailable dignity. He looked at the endless line of luxury cars, a display of wealth so vast it was beyond his comprehension. He saw the drivers efficiently and respectfully carrying bags of food and boxes of toys into her house. He was no longer the master of this small, miserable kingdom. He was nothing. Without another word, he turned, shuffled back to his rusty pickup truck, and drove away, a small man swallowed up by a world he could not understand. The rest of the day was a blur for Eleanor. The drivers formed a human chain, unloading the contents of the 100 cars. The small cottage was filled with the scent of fresh food, the sight of new clothes, the promise of a life without want. Chloe was in heaven, her eyes wide as a new bicycle, a dollhouse bigger than she was, and a mountain of books were brought in just for her. Late in the afternoon, a woman in a sharp but compassionate-looking suit arrived. She was a lawyer from the Sterling Foundation. She sat with Eleanor at her kitchen table, now covered in a bounty of fresh food, and gently walked her through the paperwork. The house was hers. A trust fund had been established for Chloe's education and future, and a consultation with the country's top pediatric cardiac surgeon was scheduled for the following week. It was all real, every last impossible detail. That evening, long after the last car had departed and a new, profound quiet had settled over the cottage, Eleanor stood in her living room. The room was transformed, filled with comfortable new furniture and the warm glow of new lamps. Chloe was fast asleep in her room, in a new bed, tucked under a thick, warm comforter, a new teddy bear clutched in her arms. Eleanor walked over to the wall where her grandfather's photograph and medal hung. In the chaos of the day, one of the drivers had accidentally knocked the shadow box, and it now hung slightly askew. She reached up to straighten it. As her fingers brushed against the frame, she looked into the painted eyes of Sergeant Michael Riley. She thought about his life, about the single moment of bravery that had earned him this medal. He had run into enemy fire to save his men, an act of selfless courage, of putting the needs of others before his own. She had not faced bullets or bombs. Her act of kindness had been small, quiet. She had simply opened her door on a stormy night. She had shared a bowl of thin soup. She had offered a stranger a place to rest. It had seemed like such a small thing, the only decent thing to do. Yet, in her world, a world defined by scarcity and fear, it had been its own form of bravery. She had given from a place of lack, not a place of plenty. And the universe, in the unlikely form of a lost billionaire, had answered in kind, magnifying her small gift 100-fold. She looked around her new home, at the evidence of a future she had never dared to dream of. The crushing weight was gone, replaced by a lightness she hadn't felt since she was a child. It wasn't just about the money, or the house, or the things that now filled it. It was the freedom from fear, the freedom to simply be a mother to her child, to watch her grow up healthy and safe. James Sterling had repaid his debt, but Eleanor knew the truest payment was not the one that could be counted in dollars. It was the affirmation of a simple, profound truth her grandfather had lived by. Courage isn't always loud, and kindness is never, ever small. It is the most powerful currency we have, a ripple of light that can, when the world is dark and stormy, return as the dawn. And for Eleanor and Chloe Vance, the sun was finally rising. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.